Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we're at the end of this series, the 9th studio album from a guy called Gerald, Silent Sound Spread Spectrum. Okay, here we are. It's time to talk about Gerald's most recent studio album. He's had some one-off singles since this thing came out in 2013, though I don't really have much to say about those, so this is where the series is finally going to come to a close. Now, I did mention the guy's previous studio effort, Tronic Jazz The Berlin Sessions, stood out to me as my personal least favorite of his albums. A move towards a far more minimalistic, micro-house sort of direction that I felt didn't really play to Gerald's strengths and was mostly kinda inconsistent and dull as a whole. The seemingly non-indicative title might have come from Gerald having improvised those pieces, that being where most of the so-called jazz influence came from, but still, that didn't result in particularly interesting compositions to me. Though, at the very least, I could see it as like a stepping stone into some different territory and a transitional moment of sorts, as I believe Gerald's excursions into minimal techno and house with an improvisational flair went over a lot more effectively and in a much more interesting way on this project. Silent Sound Spread Spectrum explores a loose concept of mind control via sound waves, named after a supposed technology used by the US Department of Defense. Whether there was any truth to the use of this technology or its actual effectiveness, Gerald was still fascinated by the idea of it, and it tying into the science of sound and acoustics and whatnot. So he worked those ideas into this project, which also happened to be a tie-in with the speaker company Bowers & Wilkins as part of their series called Society of Sound Music or something like that. Perhaps unfortunately, this album is not available for streaming anywhere at the moment, nor is it available for purchase on his Bandcamp page. I will once again have to link an unofficial upload on YouTube for those curious to hear it. Which is a shame, because it is quite solid. This album is a single 50-minute track, not really separated into parts or segments or anything. It feels like Gerald kind of let various musical ideas flow naturally however he felt. I wouldn't be surprised if it was at least partially improvised, if not entirely. Stylistically, it's his single most low-key and meditative work to date, while still mostly focusing on standard techno rhythms and patterns, perhaps with more ambient flares than before. And while it is the kind of project that I found works best as like background music to help focus on other things, and not the kind of thing that necessarily seems meant to be digested for in-depth listening, it doesn't not work in that way either. For one thing, purely on a production and mastering level, I feel like this is probably Gerald Single's strongest effort to date. He really went out of his way to make sure all of these sounds were well balanced and none of them became grating or felt cheap. Maybe there is a bit of a lo-fi feel to the occasional vocal performances from his brother David Simpson, which appear at various intervals throughout the project. They feel a bit filtered and like his voice is meant to blend into the background and stuff. But he still sounds really good. Almost as if to demonstrate how far he's come from a production standpoint, the opening stretch of this album uses a lot of sound design elements lifted out of the track American Cars from his To All Things What They Need album. When I reviewed that album, I marked that track as my least favorite, citing the very treble-heavy mastering and some synth chirping sounds that I found to be really piercing and irritating, and taking away from what should have been a really refreshing and laid-back ambient piece otherwise. The beginning of this album repurposes a lot of the exact same sounds from that track, like the water sloshing sound effects, the various electronic bleeps and strange textures, including those synth chirps I complained about. It did put some different synth pads over it, does some remastering, but the final effect was a way more satisfying mix. Even feels a bit more detailed as Gerald does some more layering with sound effects and vocal samples which talk about the above-mentioned Department of Defense technology the album is named after, and are barely audible at all. But this retooling of American Cars really only comprises the first 7-8 minutes or so of the album. As you pass that point, the piece evolves a lot more into heavier techno territory, and the progression is quite slow and gradual. At first you just got some, skittering rhythms with David Simpson's moaning voice looming over everything, but then the beats get progressively thicker, you get, some congas or tablas for percussion for a little while. The more melodic pads kind of fall away and get replaced by these repetitive synth licks that you could have heard on, a Plastic Man album or something. By the 15-minute mark or so, the transition into full-on minimal techno is complete. It almost sounds like something you could have gotten out of Cabaret Voltaire at the very tail end of their career in like the mid-90s, maybe. Though never at any point is the sense of space and overall atmosphere sacrificed. Everything does have this sort of intriguingly moody and empty feel to it, yet also feeling quite detailed in its low-key mix of beats and synths. Maybe having a Mono Lake Hong Kong sort of appeal or something like that. And there are other sounds introduced in other segments of different techno beats or synth rhythms. There's some funky guitars introduced in some parts around the 20-minute mark. I think I heard him reuse the Is There Any Escape voice sample from the old Voodoo Ray EP. And I feel like I might have heard other similar callbacks to other old works of Gerald's in various, very short intervals. I wouldn't be able to name them, but that was just the one I noticed. There are ambient diversions and moments where the track, basically rebuilds itself from the ground up. There's also a segment a little before the 45-minute mark of the album that introduces some old, dusty jazz break beats that seem to call back to his juice box days, complete with horn stabs. And that all bleeds into some pretty nice, moody and subtle but enveloping melodic chord pads for the very end. There may have been other details throughout this whole experience that I may not have noticed because I wasn't paying close enough attention and the progression of everything was too slow for me to pick up on it more naturally. But it's certainly not a project where I ever felt like I was bored or like any of the details that Gerald was exploring were getting stale or wearing out their welcome. I listened to this project 5 times in preparation for this video, perhaps with a bit of a writer's block not knowing how to tackle an album of slowly evolving minimal techno like this. But I never got sick of it, and it could probably make excellent music for studying or focusing on work or something else. I am always open to ambient techno experiences as well crafted as something like this. Nice and relaxing stuff to just lay back to and stuff. Silent Sound Spread Spectrum may not be the most mind-blowing stuff I've ever heard, and has been the case for all his post-Essence stuff. He's not really adding anything revolutionary to the electronic music landscape as a whole that hasn't already been done before. I don't know, I think it's really admirable that even this late in his career, Gerald can take his sound into new territory he hasn't really explored before and end up nailing it. An album like this that builds on his sound and legacy and deepens it further is the kind of thing that makes Gerald into the kind of artist that has made him worth delving into a proper series like this. Now, it's been almost 8 years since this album dropped. He hasn't put out a studio album since then. And I don't think he went into this intending for it to be a swan song. I'm sure someday eventually he'll get the drive to put out another one. There was one rumored around 2015, and obviously there hasn't been any word about that since. But if he decided to, announce his retirement tomorrow, hang up all his synth gear, and wanted to leave this as his last full-length album statement with his towering legacy secured, I think I'd be okay with this being the note he went out on. I really hope that doesn't happen, but you get what I mean. This is a really solid project, definitely worth a shot for any ambient techno fans out there who just want something subtle to chill and lay back to. I think I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. And we've reached the end of this series. I had been thinking about doing a worst to best ranking video, but gonna be honest, this series hasn't exactly been raking in a lot of views, and I don't think a video like that would add that much to the discussion that I haven't said already. Not to mention my personal enjoyment of the 9 projects I covered in this series is pretty close together. Here's a very quickly thrown together on-screen list of how I'd probably rank them. But yeah, I think it's finally time to move on to the next discography review. Not revealing my plans for that quite yet, so stay tuned. But of course this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.